All right, welcome to today's Explainer. If you're currently tackling the UPSC Civil Services examination, or honestly, if you just want a really high-density, data-backed briefing on the defining policy tests India is facing this week, you are exactly in the right place. We're going to take some incredibly complex, multi-layered issues from today's sources and break them down into clear, actionable takeaways. We are talking geopolitics, energy, the judiciary, climate, and internal security.
Okay, let's jump right into our agenda. We have 5 distinct topics today: the Russia oil import conundrum, the ethanol blending debate, India's judicial backlog crisis, El Niño and state preparedness, and finally, Manipur's electoral roll deletions. This should help you perfectly categorize today's macro issues for your prep.
Starting right off with Chapter 1, the Russia oil import conundrum. Get a load of this number, $46 a ton. Recent data from the Union Ministry of Commerce and Industry actually shows that India's May crude receipts from Russia have completely rebounded to pre-sanction levels. It's making up more than 40% of our total imports right now. But, there's a catch. That $46 a ton? That is the premium carried by Russian imports. And what's super fascinating here is the price impact. The data shows that the import value actually surged by 83%, while the actual volume imported fell by 2%. That dynamically shifts the economics for Indian refiners. It's likely diminishing their margins on refined products that use Russian crude.
So what does this all mean? We're essentially trying to balance commercial prudence with some pretty serious strategic risks. Yes, spot purchases capture big discounts, sometimes up to $10 a barrel compared to Brent crude. But the risks? They are significant. Paying in yuan gives China a massive edge in internationalizing its currency. On top of that, relying so heavily on a single source really threatens India's diversified energy strategy. Add in the looming threat of secondary sanctions hitting our trade channels, and you can totally see why this one-country concentration could actually erode our flexibility and credibility as an independent balancing power.
And that geopolitical energy puzzle leads us right into our domestic energy choices. Chapter 2, the ethanol blending debate.
Now, this brings up a really fascinating core dilemma. The government's policy continues to push for producing E20 petrol, which actually costs more than pure petrol to produce, even when global oil prices dip under $70 a barrel. The stated goal here is to, quote, compensate farmers adequately. But honestly, it forces us to ask a tough question. Are we prioritizing fuel over food and water security?
Let's unpack this economic chain, because the inefficiencies literally cascade downward. First off, consumers, many of whom are actually poorer than the farmers themselves, end up paying more at the pump. Then oil marketing companies procure this ethanol at an administered price. Distilleries buy the feedstock. And only at the very, very end of this whole chain do the sugarcane farmers actually see those higher prices. Plus, frankly, this model doesn't even touch the root causes of low farm incomes, like post-harvest losses.
But there is a potential fix here. Right now, ethanol is largely coming from sugarcane. And sugarcane is an incredibly water and fertilizer-intensive crop, often grown in water-stressed states like Maharashtra. But consider the alternative: 2G lignocellulosic biomass. This uses agricultural residues, things like rice and wheat straw. Now sure, it's currently more technologically demanding, and yeah, it's more expensive. But it avoids using vital cropland for fuel, and it actually helps solve the massive environmental problem of stubble burning. It's an absolutely prime area for some proactive policymaking.
Just as we see systemic inefficiencies in our energy sector, we're facing some monumental hurdles in our polity. Chapter 3. India's judicial backlog crisis.
Okay, let this number sink in for a second. 5.39 crore. As of the projected end of 2025, that is the number of cases pending across Indian courts. We're talking over 4.76 crore in district courts alone and over 92,000 in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is actually experiencing its heaviest load in 30 years. At our current pace, clearing this pile could take 3 centuries. Literally, 300 years. Which brings us to a pretty glaring contrast: essential services versus judicial vacations. Think about it. Essential services, shops, markets, hospitals, police stations, they don't just shut down completely. Their staff take personal leave, absolutely, but the institutions keep running. Yet, the Supreme Court takes a 6-week summer break alongside winter vacations. This is largely a colonial hand-me-down, originally designed for English judges who just couldn't handle the intense Indian summer heat. And while our incredibly overworked judges absolutely deserve rest, no question there, shutting the entire institution down all at once creates a massive systemic bottleneck.
And this brilliantly illustrates the human cost of that bottleneck.
Vijay L. Kelkar hit the nail on the head when he said, "Justice for 5 crore Indians is not on vacation. It is overdue." Remember, roughly 3 in 4 prisoners in India are under trials. That means they are unconvicted, presumed innocent, yet sitting behind bars. And often, they're in there for longer than their actual sentence would be, all while the courts are functioning at just a fraction of their strength.
While our courts struggle with capacity, our states are facing urgent tests of their own. Chapter 4, El Niño and State Preparedness.
Let's anchor ourselves geographically in Andhra Pradesh for a minute. Well before El Niño had even fully formed over the Pacific, this state got a really bitter preview. Back in May, daytime temperatures remained above 44 degrees Celsius for 9 consecutive days. It peaked at a staggering 48.3 degrees. This eerily echoes the strong El Niño of 2015, which tragically killed 1,369 people in Andhra Pradesh alone and actually prompted the creation of the State Disaster Management Authority in the first place.
But the heat is just half the battle, right? The monsoon is the other half, and the forecast is incredibly testing. The state's long-period average annual rainfall is 858 millimeters, but this year's projection drops down to 690 millimeters. That is a 20% deviation. To put that in perspective, that's double the deficits we've seen in recent El Niño years. This is an immediate, severe threat to agriculture and rural livelihoods, and it's going to rigorously test whether the government's preparedness exists only on paper or if it can actually mitigate the impact on the ground.
And finally, we arrive at Chapter 5, Manipur's electoral roll deletions.
The data from the Special Intensive Revision builds a rather complex, disproportionate picture. Manipur has 19 constituencies reserved for scheduled tribes. Before the revision, these areas accounted for 37.8% of the state's total voters. However, according to the draft rolls released in July, these exact same constituencies accounted for a massive 64.2% of the 1.59 lakh total voter deletions in the state.
So, decoding these disproportionate deletions. When we unpack the reasons behind them, a very clear divide emerges from the data. In the general constituencies, 41.9% of deletions were simply due to death, but in the ST constituencies, a staggering 76.1% of deletions were recorded because voters were permanently shifted or untraceable/absent. The data clearly shows these deletions were highly concentrated in and around Churachampur district, which, as we know, has been an epicenter of the ethnic violence that erupted in May 2023.
Well, we have covered a massive amount of ground today, from the geopolitics of Russian oil and the economics of ethanol, all the way to the burden of our judicial backlog, urgent climate threats in Andhra Pradesh, and the demographic shifts in Manipur's voter rolls. I want to leave you with this question. Synthesizing all this data, which of these systemic challenges do you believe poses the greatest immediate threat to India's broader developmental goals? Think about how all these issues intersect with one another. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep that focused curiosity sharp until next time.